Hi there. Today I have a special treat. So Lee Glover, who I introduced in my last video, has agreed to have a discussion with me. And fortuitously, he is in Bozeman, Montana, and this parallels exactly chapter 14, which is coming up on Sunday. So in our dialogue, we're just going to scratch the surface of Lee's experience, and he's going to just give us some brief impressions and reflections. So you can imagine how rich his experience actually was if this is just the surface. So thank you for joining me, and thanks to Lee Glover for coming on my channel. Okay, welcome to Mr. Lee Glover, who I introduced in my last video, and I apologize for the technical issues in this recording, but we can hear each other, and that's all. That's really what counts. So, Lee, where are you right now?
I am currently in Bozeman, Montana, at the home of the DeWeeses. Tina DeWeese, the daughter of Robert DeWeese, and Jenny, who were friends of Robert Pirsig. It's the home that they lived in 1968 that Robert Pirsig visited in that summer. So I'm in the living room of that house visiting Tina. And yeah, and it's just absolutely gorgeous here. You wouldn't believe it's the 1st of August in Bozeman. It is so beautiful and green, just amazingly beautiful here right now. Just extraordinary.
What's the temperature?
I think I saw it was 68 degrees when we just went grocery shopping. We came out and there was, I think, 68 in Bozeman. But a thunderstorm had just passed through, and it was the most beautiful I've seen this valley, and I've been here many times. So just beautiful.
That's wonderful. Is it as beautiful as the book describes it?
Oh yeah, more so. Of course, you know, it's different beauties at different times of the year. I've been here in the wintertime when there was snow on the ground. It's a little cold, but it's beautiful in its own way then. It was then, and but as far as just overall, just gorgeous. It's just really a gorgeous day here, with being as green as it is, compared to where I live, which is down in Idaho, which is turning quite brown right now, this time of the year, but it's still lush green and just real pretty.
Oh, that's wonderful. So
yeah.
is
and the canyon.
And the canyon, tell me about that.
Well, so the geographically north of or south of Bozeman, there are sort of like parallel canyons, and the DeWeeses lived in the canyon called Cottonwood Canyon. It's Cottonwood Creek flows next to the house, and it's just a gorgeous canyon, you know, with steep hills on either side that Cottonwood Creek flows down into, and there's a couple other parallel ones, you know, and ridges over, and they're south of Bozeman. It's probably a 10-15 minute drive from downtown Bozeman to get here, but really pretty out here. Looking out of the window right now. Let me just kind of spin this around real quick and show you that window view.
Yeah, I don't think the video isn't great at all. It's kind of choppy, but yes, we can see a little bit of the greenery out there.
Yeah, and that's looking toward the creek, which is just down the hill. And if you go outside, if we were outside, like I wish I was, but there'd be microphone noise, you can hear the Cottonwood Creek rushing by below, and that's actually described in the book, the water going by, and it really lulls you to sleep at night if you can hear it at nighttime. They had a yurt here at one time, and I've slept out in the yurt, which is just right next to the creek, and talk about going to sleep really easily with the creek behind it. It's just a wonderful sound. But yeah, it's just beautiful here.
So this is very opportune because the next chapter we're doing is the one where they all go to the DeWeese's house.
Yeah, that's great.
So
Good timing.
This is amazing. So you had been here. The first time you came here was in 2008 on that motorcycle trip when you took the motorcycle trip?
Yes, it was July of 2008 when I set off going east from the Boise area, and stopped here for the first time and become actually pretty good friends with Tina and her partner Tom Thornton. They're both artists here, and so we've
They're
stayed in
artists
touch
also.
over the years.
They're
Yep.
artists like her parents.
Wonderful art. Yes, yeah. They're part of this art community here in this area. Play a pretty influential role, but really great artists in their own right. And we become friends over the years, and I visit every time I come up here, and we enjoy each other's company. So yeah, it's great.
Oh, that's great.
It's one of the I think it's the best friend that's come out of my my journey in having done this. And I was sitting right at the same table in the DeWeese home. I remember the first conversation, and they were complete strangers. And here's this other stranger coming into their home that they invited in and asking questions, but they were very gracious, and it was the beginning of a long friendship. So
yes, it's 11 years now.
11 years. Oddly, today, another kind of coincidence was 11 years to the day when I set off on my journey from the Pirsig home in St. Paul, Minnesota, heading west. I left my home in July and went east, but when I officially started the route, retracing, was on August 1st of 2008. So today is 11 years to the day when I had my motorcycle and I mounted my camera to it, and I rode from the Pirsig home in St. Paul over to the Mississippi River and crossed the Mississippi River and had some footage of that, like when they left on that morning in July of 1968. So yeah, that was pretty neat doing that.
That is really neat, and it's so great you have footage.
11 years.
Yes.
Yeah, and I'll show that to the world one of these days. But 11 years to the day.
Well, that we'll be grateful for that. So so tell me what you did today.
So there was a gentleman by the name of Henry Gurr. I think you may have probably mentioned him a few times. He is probably more so than anyone else a archivist or a historian who has done an extensive amount of work in writings and history and information about the route itself. He's traveled the route, and so we met in my journey years ago, and in fact I interviewed him. But he wrote a book about Sarah Vinke, who, for readers of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, will recognize Sarah Vinke as the person who inspired Pirsig with the word quality. That's how he said that the word quality created this kind of seed crystal moment in his office at Montana Hall. And so Henry Gurr has co-authored a book about a biography of Sarah Vinke. So he's been traveling on a book signing tour. And so he did an event today at the bookstore at Montana State University talking about his book and about Sarah Vinke and just about, the Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. So we had a really fun conversation. It was a good morning.
That's great.
So and I had breakfast with Tina and Tom and had just a start, and I slept out in my van out in front of the house, and it was just he got in late last night, and it's been a good. And this is, as they say, this is God's country, right? Montana.
Yes. Yes. In several ways. So anyway,
but it's good.
So tell me some things about so we're coming up in the chapter to the DeWeese's house. Tell me some things about your original journey and some things you discovered, maybe pertaining to this particular point, but in general, I know you have a lot a lot of different reflections you have about the journey you made, and about about the land and the the topography and just general reflections in terms of the journey and your and the book, and maybe just tell us some things.
Sure. Yeah, well, I can always do that. So let me go back and rewind just a little bit and maybe talk a little bit about my interest in how I came to a little bit about how I came to even doing that as a setup for answering your question. It might be helpful to have some context.
Yes.
So when I set off, I won't go into the whole story, the backstory, but nonetheless, I had discovered the book at a yard sale in 2005, and events happened. I won't go into that. That created the idea to travel the route in the summer of 2008. It was 40 years after the trip in the book, and that seemed like 40 has some significance as a number, the number of completion, and you see that a lot in numerology. And so I thought that was a good natural time to go travel the route in 40 years later. And the idea at the time was to go and just create video of various places. And it was an attempt to learn video technology. I was thinking about a video production business, and the whole idea was just as a kind of excuse to get out of town and learn video. And I thought what might come out of it was some kind of maybe travel video or clips for YouTube that I could share. And so that was kind of the genesis of it. But as it went on, I got really interested into the places and the people. And so I started doing a lot of research into the places on the route, some history and other kinds of stories of historical significance related to the book and the history of the route. And so what kind of drew me in. And so in that process, I discovered really a lot of interesting historical stories about people and places that ultimately ended up in kind of my own personal transformative journey that became really quite interesting, which is a story in its own right. But in my own kind of discoveries of geology and geography and things that I think are pretty rich in meaning. And there are some of those around here that I think are quite meaningful in this really beautiful country. Yeah. And so I do intend to share those someday. But some things that aren't called out or spelled out specifically in the books that Robert Pirsig wrote. He may have known some of these things, maybe he didn't. I don't really know. But they're kind of intriguing because they're beautiful in a meaningful way in the context of really just beautiful scenery that's in this part of the country. So that's what kind of set me off on this journey, and I ended up here. Met a lot of people along the way, including the DeWeeses here. And when I was here in 2008, one of the stories I'll share and then throw it back was the Jenny DeWeese. And Jenny and Bob DeWeese were the two authors, and they're kind of considered the mother and father of Montana art, the matriarch and patriarch of Montana art. So they're kind of legendary figures here in Montana. And Jenny DeWeese, she passed away in November, I think it was, or late 2007. So I never had a chance to meet her. And but when I came here in 2008, Tina was very gracious, and we hit it off pretty well. And she allowed me to visit Jenny's studio, which was pretty much unchanged from when because Jenny lived there in the studio, which is a building right next to the house here. And so I was able to enter what was Jenny's world. And it was really fascinating because there was just art everywhere, both hers and art that had been given as gifts. And it was just an immersive, wonderful experience. And I ended up shooting a lot of footage of the studio and ended up creating a video for the family, because they were in the process of starting to archive and store all of that and move it out of the studio. And so I created a visual record, so it worked out pretty well, where I was able to archive at least what it all looked like when Jenny was living there. And so I really kind of became a documentarian of Jenny's studio. And that was pretty neat to have that experience and then be able to share that with the family, so they have a permanent record of what the studio was like.
That's fantastic.
And it really was
very valuable.
It was Jenny's world. It was her world. I mean, and you could just, her presence was just really strong there, and what she has surrounded herself with in this beautiful area. So that was a very rewarding and rich experience.
So so in the book, they're in the dining, a lot of the original introduction is in a dining room. You know, he sort of remembers that he was fixing, um, I forgot what Jenny and
Robert
Bob.
DeWeese,
That's it,
her
Robert.
husband.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he was fixing Robert's table, and it was kind of a contrast as to their different personalities and different problems, ways of, you know,
Mm-hmm.
solving problems, and to what degree were they classic, romantic, you know.
Yeah.
So is that dining room table still upstairs?
I'm sitting at a dining room table right now, but to my understanding, and I've asked that specific question,
Uh-huh.
this is not that same table, and nor is it 100% certain that event actually occurred, but I'd
Uh-huh.
like to think it did.
I like to
It's a
think it too.
neat story about problem solving. And a clever way to solve a particular
Hmm.
problem in a rational way, because it made
In a
sense, right?
rational
You
way,
wrap
yeah.
twine around the table to hold something in place, and while the glue dries. But it's not this particular table.
So, but on the back, in the
And
background.
I'm actually feeling. Go ahead. And it's actually, this is as a solid wood, so it
Uh-huh.
doesn't have this
So it doesn't
veneer
have
on
the
the side.
veneer.
So
Okay, so it definitely is
no,
not that.
it's not the same table. I can tell you right now because I'm feeling the edge of it
Yeah.
right now as we speak.
So, I mean, you can sort of see that there's a lot of like I said, the video is not very good, so it's kind of fuzzy, but you can see behind you there's an awful lot of artwork. Is that some of
Yeah, yeah.
is that some of the original stuff that was there before?
I have no idea how a lot of this has been here for quite a while, but I'm not an expert on what's here, so I don't know if I know the answer to that question.
Uh-huh.
I'm sure a lot of it some of it I know is Bob's. I recognize some of it, but I don't know. The family here has collected art from various people in various places, and I just don't remember all the stories. So that's not something I'm an expert on. Sorry.
So what did
But
the
yeah,
DeWeese?
and that was
Yeah, there's a
typically.
lot of
Go
it.
ahead.
So what did the
Yeah,
so
there.
you've interviewed Tina. Did she actually meet Bob Pirsig?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. They knew each other, sure.
So
Yeah,
so
and multiple encounters. Yeah.
so could you kind of share, do you remember, could you share some of the things she said about, you know, what Bob Pirsig was like, and
Um,
and her opinion of, you know, how everyone was depicted in the book?
yeah. Well, I don't know if I could really sum that up. I don't want to put words in her mouth too much. I'm trying to kind of condense this down in my head of things I've heard. I think the general perception, I'll speak in more generalities,
Hmm.
was that the general perception was he was someone who was obviously brilliant and very focused and very centered on the things that he was at the time involved in studying and trying to understand. Um, and I'll defer to more, I think, a general perception rather than specifics of what Tina or others said, was to tell the story about the studio in Bozeman, which is a fascinating story
Okay.
that in the late 50s, and kind of another way to answer your question on the general perception of Robert Pirsig back then
Hmm.
in the late 60s. So Robert DeWeese had at one time in the late 50s had a studio in downtown Bozeman on Main Street, and it was there was a community of artists around here who is a social group, and it was kind of a bit of a clique in the sense that they were artists in a very conservative area. So
Yes.
there was this interesting dynamic
Hmm.
of this group of artists in conservative Montana of the 1950s.
Hmm.
And so they had their own kind of social circle and gatherings, and a lot of it was centered around this Bob DeWeese's studio in downtown Bozeman. And I heard this from multiple people. Tina was there at some of these parties as well. But these were quite, a bunch of artists getting together. There was a lot of talk, a lot of conversation,
Hmm.
a fair amount of alcohol consumed,
Oh, sure.
but great social with lots of fun, lots of memories. But Robert DeWeese was there somewhat frequently at these parties, and the perception and the descriptions I've heard from those was that he would be there and he would tend to be very focused on his philosophy and other kinds of things that he was interested in.
You're talking about
and
Bob
he
Pirsig,
could
right?
even get to Bob Pirsig, yep.
Yeah.
And he would tend to get, he could dominate conversations when he got really into his start talking about the things that were interesting to him at the time, because he was quite centered on them, is the term that I've heard multiple times. But everyone recognized that he really was brilliant.
Yeah.
And they wondered about where he was going to go with this. And part of the funny thing of the story was he would talk about writing a book, and for years he was going to write a book, and no one really believed that. He would, because he had all these ideas, and these are out there ideas, and people would kind of go, "Yeah, Bob, yeah, okay, yeah, oh, yeah, whatever," and he talked about, "Yeah, someday I'm going to write a book," and then one day suddenly out comes this book, and it was like this kind of collective shock. He actually wrote a book, and he actually did it. And then it became, of course, a bestseller and a phenomenon. And but they had heard about this long before it actually became a reality. This idea that they kind of laughed and joked about because they didn't know if that would ever happen. They thought, they just kind of, that's just Robert Pirsig. And anyway, yeah. And there's a story, and someday I'll have this on YouTube, because I want to share this interview, is Willa Varsness, a friend of the Pirsigs, who's mentioned in the book, tells a story about Robert Pirsig coming into one of these parties. And this, I think, is really kind of telling in many ways about the perception of him, to help answer the question that you asked, was when he came to one of these parties, and he had this, what he described, Robert Pirsig described as a picture book of philosophy. And he was really excited that he had this picture book about philosophy, and the group just really gave him a hard time about how can you have a picture book about philosophy? How's that possible? And I guess they really just ribbed him for that. And I'm not sure he quite appreciated that his excitement about that a picture book about philosophy, that bubble was burst by the artist at the studio. So yeah, that's a great story.
That is a great story. Yeah, they just didn't know what was milling around up there, did they? But I'm actually curious. Do they remember anything like when he was talking, just in casual conversation, that ended up making sense? Like didn't make sense when he was talking, but like was a revelation when they actually read the book, or when the book actually came out?
To a certain extent. Again, I don't want to speak for others, but some of the things that he had been talking about, reading the book, the dots connected. Oh, so that was what that was all about. Because some of the ideas were, back then at that time were abstract and very out there, and to kind of make it more concrete as he did as concrete as it is, which is still a little bit abstract, but it helped connect some of those dots. Oh, that's what he meant. I think that was a general thing I tended to hear from people who read the book, and also heard him talk about these ideas back in the late 50s. Yeah. And that's the fun part of doing something like this, is all the people you meet, and the stories you hear, and the perspectives. It's really neat, yeah. And then I was getting to share some of those, even, maybe secondhand, but and from some people who aren't around anymore to share them anymore. And so it's great to have that opportunity.
And there is one person in particular who's not around anymore that you did get to interview, the John Sutherland.
Great guy, wonderful person. Yeah. John and I, we hit it off pretty well. He lived in Minneapolis at the time, and it was the first real interview I conducted, so I was a little nervous. It's like I'm interviewing John Sutherland, the famous John Sutherland, and it's my first real interview, and I'm going to really mess this up. But he couldn't have been nicer. John was wonderful, and we met at his house in Minneapolis, and just super nice. And we and I happened to go back, and every time I was in the Twin Cities, I would visit him, and I'd take him out to lunch or dinner or something, and really enjoyed spending time together. And it was kind of interesting, because even though our relationship was not that long, and we only visited it maybe 3 or 4 times, John never had a son. And I think he really kind of valued, because it was almost like a father figure to me in some way, because he was very left of center with his political views, and he was quite open about his politics, but he was just a great sense of humor, and so I just really enjoyed talking to him, because he would bring a perspective that I didn't hear very often. And so in this kind of a way, he was a bit of a father figure, and the way he talked about politics. And he didn't have a son, so I think he really liked sharing those ideas with me. And so we just had great times together. And the last time I saw him, which was the photo that you showed on your channel, was on my birthday in 2011. And that was a fond memory. I was coming back from the Dakotas on that day, and coming back, we had a dinner date. And I had stopped in Wadena, Minnesota, which is north central Minnesota, and a thunderstorm had hit. I mean, and this was it was like that first chapter of Zen in the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. It was a really powerful thunderstorm, lightning struck, and it kind of chased me all the way to the Twin Cities. And it was just right behind me, and so I was trying to race and get ahead of the storm before we got to the Twin Cities, because I had this dinner date with John, and so I got there and picked him up, and we drove to this restaurant, had a wonderful dinner, and then we left the restaurant. As we're walking back to the car, it starts to rain, and so by the time we get back to his house, the heavens had opened, and it was just pouring, and there was lightning and thunder, and so we just sat in the car for the next hour and a half just talking about everything. And it was like, that's my memory of John, because that's the last time I saw him. And reflecting about that, it was such just a nice time, just a nice moment. I was a really nice person who I had encountered in my life and my journey, and we were sharing this moment, surrounded by thunder and lightning and torrential rains in front of his house. We talked about life and family and philosophy and religion, politics, book, and all this stuff. And he was like anyone else, just another person. But what a wonderful time. And then the storm passed, and he hopped out, and I said, John, we got to get a picture. And so I put the camera on top of the car, and the photo on your channel is just, the camera was sitting on top of the car. I turned the timer on, and I snapped that photo, and it was the last time I saw John in person.
It's a wonderful photo.
He passed away in 2012. Yeah. So fond memories of that moment.
Yeah, well, I'm so glad you got to know.
That's a good story. Yeah. What a reward that was to have that
Absolutely.
opportunity. Yeah.
But
I didn't get to.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead with your question.
The audio.
I didn't get to meet Robert Pirsig. I didn't get to meet Robert Pirsig. I didn't even try to. Robert Pirsig, didn't meet him.
It is. So it was really. It seemed a little bit. Just because he's reclusive, and just to protect his privacy, you didn't try.
Yeah, pretty much. I didn't want to bother him. I thought about it a lot of times, and Tina bugged me all the time. Said, Lee, you need to write to him. You need to tell him what you're doing. You need to, no, Tina, I don't want to bother him. He likes his privacy. I'm not asking. I don't need to ask him anything. He said that, if you want to know about me, just read my books.
Right.
And so I took that to heart, and I decided just to let him have his space. I didn't want to be another person asking questions and occupying his time. I wish he was around because I would love to have some conversations with him
Don't
about
we?
some things
Yeah.
that I've learned. But it's too late for that. If I circle back now, I'll try to do a circle back to your question.
Uh-huh.
Earlier, you asked about this area. One of the things that's really meaningful to me is my father was a big part of my journey that really began here in 2008.
That's right.
And through that process, I had this kind of idea that came into my head at the end of 2010 about doing things while you still can. And is an idea that I actually developed in Las Vegas, of all places, but that's a whole nother story, about do things while you still can, and it developed into this idea about asking my father to go hiking in the mountains not far from here where Robert and Chris went hiking in the book. It's just, they started out at the house here and hiked over the ridge of the mountains here, beautiful mountains. And so I asked my dad in January of 2011, asked him if he wanted to go on a hike with me in Montana, and he was 77, I believe, at the time. And he said yes, and it really was the last time we had that opportunity. So in August of 2011, he and I went hiking up the mountains, the same mountains that Robert and Chris went hiking. And he went quite a ways, my father did, and went up probably about 3,000 feet before he went as far as he could. And he stopped and rested, and I went the rest of the way.
Yeah.
But that was a rich experience. And for my dad, he said that was one of his best, one of his most memorable experiences in his life. He just really valued that experience, and he's no longer here. So, and we had that chance. So that was neat. And that came about of, having gone off on a journey and ultimately having an idea to go on a hike and producing a memorable experience.
Yes.
So this place actually has a lot of me.
Yeah, makes sense.
And parallel.
Yeah, a parallel memorable experience, a father and son. And for you and your father, a very meaningful hike because, as you said, it was toward the end of his life, I guess.
Yeah. And if I can indulge your audience for just a minute
please
to talk about what because I still think it was just kind of an amazing thing. But it happened in Las Vegas. I was doing research, as I said earlier. I was researching various people and places on the route, and one of the places and people that was of great interest to me was another Robert, Robert Knievel, aka Evil Knievel, another Robert who was born and raised in Butte, Montana. He was a Montana boy, and of course he became famous in '68 because of motorcycles. And so there's kind of these two parallel journeys. One of Robert Pirsig in 1968, and then there's this parallel journey of Robert Knievel in 1968, who had crashed at the beginning of 1968, actually December 31st, 1967. He tried to jump the fountains at Caesar's Palace and crashed in famous video, Wide World of Sports and all of that stuff. And so I was researching his journey in 1968, and part of that journey was to go to Las Vegas to see where he had tried to jump the fountains at Caesar's Palace. And so I went there, and I was totally shocked when I went where and everyone knows the famous video where Knievel crashes and he's rolling and tumbling and the motorcycle's rolling and tumbling. And well, if you go there, what is at that location where he crashed? It's fascinating. But there's a Buddha shrine, and it's the only one in America. Is this gorgeous? It's the Thai Buddhism, Thailand's version of Buddhism. From, I believe is the pronunciation, but I could be mistaken. But it's this beautiful statue of their version of the Buddha. Occupies the space where people was rolling and tumbling, and I didn't expect to find that there. And it's kind of tucked away. So if you ever go to Caesar's Palace or in Las Vegas, make sure you check out that spot because it's quite meaningful. And so I'm looking at that, and I'm just kind of like really caught up in this moment of the history, and scratching my head, going, how did this end up here? And at this, of all places they could have put this shrine, it occupies a place where where Knievel was rolling and tumbling. And I was thinking, because it was years later, Robbie Knievel, Knievel's son, Robbie, he jumped the fountain successfully. And it was that inspired the idea of, well, he had time, Robbie made that jump while his father was still living. And his father got to witness his son do what he had not succeeded in doing. And it was exactly that inspired me to go, yeah, you don't get forever to do these things. And it was out of that where the idea came to go on that mountain. And it was inspired to a great extent by this beautiful shrine there at that particular spot at Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas. Yeah, it's pretty cool. Good stuff, yeah.
So the meeting of East and West.
Yeah, very memorable. You think about it, it really is. And the shrine is considered to be good luck for those on a journey. There's a plaque there, and it talks about that this is a symbol for those of good luck for those on a journey. I thought that's pretty appropriate, pretty cool.
A lot of parallels coming together.
It was a good experience, very rewarding in many ways, and I'm very much glad I did it. I didn't make the video that I had planned on doing, but I did make a video that I did present in 2012 at the Chautauqua that they had at Montana State University. I was invited to show a film there, and I threw together a film in a very short time that I was able to show there. And so that was kind of a full circle, because I started off on that journey in 2008 with really no idea what that book meant. I was, kind of just starting out. It was over my head.
Yes.
And I had only read it one time. And and so it was also kind of the learning experience, trying to step into this world and trying to learn what is there about this great book? Why was it such a huge phenomenon? And so I went off and retraced the route while also trying to understand what this book was all about. And then 4 years later, because of contacts and because of footage I had collected, that I had the opportunity to actually present a video at an event in Bozeman honoring Bob Pirsig. So that was just really neat.
Yeah, that's
to go full circle on that and actually present that. That's good. It turned out really well.
Well, there's a little bit of footage of that Chautauqua on YouTube. It's very brief and it leaves out a lot of stuff. But everyone, you can't see everyone. And you're in there. There's a brief clip of you. I don't know if you've seen this or not.
I'm sure I've seen parts of it. I've seen some clips of that. Yeah. Can you see how exhausted I was? I was literally working like 20-hour days for weeks. Oh, I had worked. I was doing everything I could to have something for that event, and I was just drained. I was so tired. But if you also saw the motorcycle in there.
Yes, and that was the centerpiece of that whole Chautauqua.
That was mine. That was the one that I had.
Yeah.
Can you mind if I tell that story real quick?
Yeah. No,
because that's a great story.
Yeah.
So in fact, I just told that earlier today, so I'll repeat that story because it was so neat. This is I think early June of 2008. I'm planning and ready to leave in a month on my trip back, to follow the route. And I had planned on just taking my minivan and, equipment and going on this trip. And it was about a month before, one day I get this idea that, it'd be great if I had a motorcycle with me. I can't ride because I have too much equipment. I have to have, a car for equipment. But it'd be nice to have a motorcycle. And I didn't have one at the time. And and then I thought, well, it'd be better if I had a Honda or a cycle like Robert Pirsig's. And so I thought, well, what are the chances? I mean, zero, right? Zero. There's no chance. But I did an internet search, and there were there was like 3 for sale in the entire country, the United States, and they were at various locations. 2 of them were impossible, but there was one that was for sale in Milwaukee. Well, oddly, Milwaukee was on my planned route of travel. I was actually planning on going to Milwaukee already, and this one was so and it was perfect. It was owned by a collector, so it was in mint condition. It ran. It was a 1964, same year, 305 CT Super Hawk. Other than the color, it was just identical to Robert Pirsig's, and so I called and we made a deal. I actually gave him an offer. He accepted, which was lower than his asking price, and overnighted a check because I was so paranoid that I'm going to lose this. Yeah. And so I overnighted a deposit check. He gets it next day. And so I go and I travel east and I go past the Twin Cities, go to Milwaukee, and I pick up the cycle and I pay the balance. And we're talking after we've closed the deal, and his name is Ben Shabahang. He was an Oriental rug dealer, and beautiful rugs in this store. But we were talking, and he goes, "Lee, I have to tell you a story about that cycle." And it actually was owned by his father at one time. But he said, you know, I put that on Craigslist like in January or February of 2008. And he said, months went by. Not a single person contacted me about that cycle on Craigslist. And then one day in June, you contacted me and made a deal. And he said that like the day after or the day that he received my deposit check, he got a full price offer for this after not hearing a thing. So, you know, I like to think it was kind of waiting for me, I guess. I don't know, but it was perfect because I put it on my trailer, and just having it, I had people come from out of the woodwork. I'd be parked someplace and I'd go in and I'd come back out and I'd have 3 or 4, usually men, but they'd be surrounded there and they'd have all these stories about, yeah, my dad had one of those. And, oh, I just loved riding that thing. You know, and it's just, and I met all kinds of people I would have never met had I have not had that little cycle with me in my trailer. It was just, yeah, so it's a great deal. And I've ridden it quite a bit. Right now it's in my shop, undergoing an overhaul. But
are you doing it? Really fun. Are you maintaining your motorcycle?
I'm doing it, yeah, of course.
Wow.
Doing it well. So. Yeah, so I'm working on an overhaul, and it's a vintage machine, and I kind of abused it a little bit on that trip. I felt kind of bad, but I pushed it pretty hard.
You were classic enough.
An old cycle. It was, but it's a great little machine. But having one of those, you appreciate the endurance it required for that trip. That wasn't just a Sunday ride. Yeah. That was a feat of endurance.
Absolutely.
Because cycles, just the vibration of those machines is such that it just wears you out after hours of riding. And I think the longest ride I've been on it is maybe 2 hours at the most, and I'm just exhausted. So it does take its toll, but it's a fun little bike to ride.
So did any of the people come up to you and say, "Oh, this is the same"? Were there any people who came up and said, "This is what Pirsig was writing in Zen in the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance"? Any people, you know, kind of identifying it on those terms?
I had some people who, when I told them, they would connect it. They didn't necessarily instantly connect it, but they would recognize it once I made the connection. They go, "Oh yeah, okay." I had one person I met at an air show in Wisconsin, who I put a notice on a bulletin board that I was trying to find people who were interested in that, and he had, I don't remember exactly, but he had some connection to the cycle in some way, and so he knew the meaning of that. So there were a few of those, but I don't recall anyone that came up and said immediately, "Yep, I know what that cycle is. I know it was the one Robert Pirsig was riding." But I did have people that after I made that connection, they recognized. They knew the book, and they knew roughly the cycle, but they didn't necessarily know it was a 1964 Honda Super Hawk. Yeah. And for some, it's a real treat when they, because I met people who I would have never met who were big fans of the book, and so for them to see that cycle and see that connection, that was a pretty neat experience for them.
Oh yeah, it was.
They really enjoyed having.
Yeah, I love seeing it in the in that little clip of the Chautauqua. I said, "Oh, so that's what it looked like."
That's what it looked like, yeah. And I saw that in the clip you showed, and that's in North Dakota, a town, Milnor, North Dakota. There's a place where they stopped to rest, and it's one of the photos from the trip. Where they started a little shelter there, and he showed this photo of my cycle, and then the photograph taken in 1968. And so in 2008, I stopped there and set my cycle up. I tried to put my motorcycle in the exact same spot, and then put the photo from 68 next to it. That was the whole idea of that, with the same shelter in the background.
Absolutely.
And I worked really hard trying to find, and I moved it around, and I adjusted it, and I checked the angles. It's like okay, right this time, and because I wanted it in the exact same spot, and it was pretty close.
Job. Yeah, you did. And it's funny, the weather was the same that day, and it looked exactly the same. It was really cool. You must have been thrilled to see that thing was still there. That shelter.
Oh yeah,
Might not have been.
Well, that was true with. But I could spend the next 2 hours talking about places and what's changed, what hasn't been, and there's so many just neat stories about various places that are mentioned in the book, and the historical connections, that like you go there and you go, I've seen photos of that, or he described it. I'll share one story if you can indulge me for a moment. It's one of the better stories, and there are so many along the route, but this one is one I really like because it's very meaningful. For anyone who happens to ever visit Oregon, Western Oregon, I highly encourage you to do this because it actually has a connection. And it's not one I've told you, actually, so this will be a new story. But it's a really neat story because it connects in an interesting way. But in the book, and you'll get to this at some later chapter, when they pass through a town called Dayville, Oregon. And it's a little small town in eastern Oregon, and what's neat about Dayville, it's in the middle of the eastern Oregon desert, and it had these huge shade trees, and Pirsig called them cottonwoods, but they're actually poplars, but he called them cottonwoods. And that's where they stopped, and he mentioned the quote-unquote Chinaman's ditch, having fed the trees there. That's why the trees are so big, because as Pirsig said, it was the Chinese who built the ditches, and he slept in the yard, right? And so I have a lot of footage of that town and that area, and there's a little interesting backstory to that, that's not in the book, but the house where he and Chris, they slept in the front yard of this house. They were tired, and they slept there, and they took a nap in the front yard, and the house was actually the house of the mayor, but in the book it's referred to as the fire warden of Dayville, which was correct. He was the fire warden, but he was also the mayor of Dayville. So when they slept in the front yard, they're actually sleeping in the front yard of the mayor's house, who happened to also be the fire warden. Well, his name was Paul Grindstaff, and very well known in that area. And he and his wife had adopted their grandchildren after their father was killed in a lumber accident. And his grandson, his name is Jewel Youngren. He was coming home from football practice at the school in this little town of Dayville one day in 1968, and he walks into his house, and there's this father and son sleeping in his front yard with a motorcycle there. And I have this on film. I did an interview with this gentleman years ago, Jewel, and he was telling the story about coming home, and there was this motorcycle, and Robert and Chris Pirsig lying in the front. Of course, he didn't mean anything at the time. And so he saw them actually sleeping in his own front yard, and he just went in the house and whatever. But what's interesting is years later, if you ever visit Salem, Oregon, in Riverfront Park, which is river. It was an old pulp mill for Boise Cascade Corporation. They used to have a paper mill right on the Willamette River next to downtown Salem, Oregon.
Mm-hmm.
They donated the property after the mill closed, and they had this in 1963. There was this. They brought in this big metal ball to hold acid used for processing wood pulp.
Mm-hmm.
And it was brought down the Willamette River and the Columbia River, and they brought it there, and for decades it held acid for the pulp process. Well, when they closed the mill and they donated the property, there was a question, well, what do we do with this big round metal ball that's full of toxic acid, or once had this acid in it? And Jewel was one of the people who came up with the idea, well, why don't we turn that into an earth? And it was one of these things that it was like a seed crystal. How these little things, it's like an idea, how it takes root, and it suddenly explodes into something huge. And this is one of those things because it just struck a chord with the entire community, and artists and people from all walks of life, all ages, ethnicity, all work together to build what they call Eco Earth. And it's the centerpiece of Riverfront Park is this, and it's probably 20 foot in diameter ball that's covered in tiles with all kinds of scenery. It's of the earth. Mm-hmm. And you see the planets and the oceans and all these peoples and that cover this, and it's just really beautiful and really meaningful. And all these thousands and thousands and thousands of tiles were all cut by Jewel Youngren, the boy who happened to see Robert and Chris Pirsig in his front yard in '68. So if you ever get to Salem, Oregon, make sure you see that, because it has a connection back to Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance and this young boy who happened to encounter father and son on the journey in 1968. But he went on to devote years of his life hand cutting thousands of little tiles that were glued onto the side as part of this symbol of the earth and ecological care for the planet. And it's a wonderful symbol. So make a point to see it if you're ever in Salem, Oregon. So that's one of the better stories that came out of my research of people and their intersections with this story in one way or another. Yeah.
Well, I would say, Lee, that you are the master of seeing the connections to this story, in this story. And this
I'll take I'm maybe. Yes, yeah. And I'm proud of you.
Well, some of the things you've told me are just, they're mind-blowing. And I hope at some point that, you'll share a little bit more. But I've really loved these stories. And it's, it tickles me that you're at the DeWeese's house today, because Sunday we're going to be talking about that. So yet you are the master of connections.
Stories are the people stories.
Yeah.
And there are so many. I could tell so many stories of just people I've met, people that did interesting and important things along this journey, and they're countless. And I'm just scratching the surface.
Yeah.
But it's the people that really make it interesting. Exactly. So, but yeah, it was a great experience, and sometime I've enjoyed your channel tremendously. It's been
thank you
it's
so
been
much.
just great to.
Well, I'm working some stuff out here, little by little. I'm, trying to figure things out, and you've been really helpful. I really appreciate it, because I kind of fumble through it, I guess, sometimes, and get a little bit more clarity, and then sometimes get a little bit more confused, and then a little bit more clarity. So you've been so helpful, and I really appreciate it. And
well, hopefully I'm some clarity, and not just confusion.
I confused myself. You've given me clarity. So, and I really appreciate you sharing the footage with me, and the whole Beartooth Pass thing. I probably, had you not told me about that, I would have glossed that over in discussing that chapter. And it's sort of extraordinary to think that such a place exists.
Mm-hmm. It's mind-boggling.
Yeah.
When I and that's worthy of a whole video itself, just to talk about about. And that was what my film in Bozeman I showed in 2012 was centered on that. But the concepts underlying it are pretty foreign to most people, as they were to me until early 2012 when I discovered some things and had a lot of learning to do. But it really is quite an extraordinary place and very meaningful. And not just it's physically beautiful, but it's beautiful also in meaning. Yeah.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
I hope to share more about that in the not too distant future and do some more explanation of what some of that means. So you've inspired me to kind of now start doing something with all of this material I've been sitting on for so long.
Well, I'm glad you are, because it's really great stuff. And remember what you said at the beginning of this video, you've got to do it while you can.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
So, well, this has been a pleasure.
This has been such a pleasure, and I hope this is the first of more to come.
Well, let's hope so. Great.
Okay. So
and a great place to be. Great time to be here. So yeah, it's all good.
Okay, so you have a nice dinner with the DeWeeses, or at least with Tina. and
the others. We got Henry coming over, so yeah, it's
and Henry Gurr and the crew, and I wish I was there. And so it's been a pleasure, and I will see you next time.
See you. Bye.